The GTX 580 Classified, one of the fastest single Fermi-based cards ever made. This card comes equipped with 512 CUDA cores, an 855 MHz core clock, and a whopping 3GB of fast GDDR5. Now all of this comes housed in a no-nonsense all-black design that screams "overclock me." This Classified was released in October of 2011, which is almost a full year after the release of the GTX 580. It was priced at $600 USD, which is quite a bit to stomach at the time, but it's obvious this card catered to the overclocker in all of us. Upon release, EVGA announced a 1.5GB and a 3GB version of the card, as well as the Ultra version. Now that came with a core clock of 900 MHz out of the box, but aside from those differences, all of the 580 Classifieds were essentially identical. So, you might ask yourself, what features does this Classified have over the reference GTX 580? Well, I'm glad I asked. First, we have a BIOS switch. Now toggling this will put the card in overclock mode, which allows for voltage adjustment. It disables overcurrent and thermal protection as well. Next, we have EVBot support. Now the EVBot allows for adjustment of voltages, changes in PWM frequency, and again disables OCP without any software. Now voltage measurement points are included. This will allow accurate voltage readings directly from your graphics card, which is more accurate than software. Now this beast also has 14 power phases and 3 memory phases. Now these are housed under a robust memory MOSFET plate, and above the vapor chamber heatsink resides a monster 80mm blower fan. It's loud, but it does get the job done. The Classified also has support for 3- and 4-way SLI. The Classified's PCB is about an inch taller than the reference PCB, and it comes in at 11 inches long. Now the extra inch allows for all of the power phases to fit on board, and it gives more heatsink surface area as some of the heat produced does get blown through a top vent as shown here. At the top of the card you can see not one, not two, but 3 PEG connectors. We have 2 8-pin and 1 6-pin. If you were to add all of these up per the ATX spec, this could draw up to 450 watts, but with enough love and voltage, you can blow well past that spec. Next to the PEG connectors, you can see 3 connectors for checking the card voltages with a multimeter. Here we can check the VCore, the PLL, and the memory voltages. Connectivity options are only 2 DVI ports, but there's also a connector for the EVGA EVBot, which unfortunately I don't have. Since we're overclocking on air, it's not really needed. Alright, well that pretty much wraps up the features of the card, but what about the questions you all have right about now? Some like, how well does a 580 Classified hold up in games today? How well does it overclock? How much power does it draw? But most importantly, is Fermi dead now like its driver support? These are all great questions, and hopefully today we can put some of them to rest. Before we jump into performance numbers, let's disassemble the card and clean her up and apply some new TIM. After that, we'll see how well she overclocks. First, let's remove the cooler, and here we can see the memory thermal pads are pretty much destroyed, so I did end up replacing them. Now the power and memory MOSFET thermal pads were still in great shape, so nothing really needed to be done there. Now the previous owner did a great job of keeping the card clean, so there wasn't much in the way of dust inside the heatsink. Again, I did replace the thermal paste, but it was in decent shape considering its age. It's hard not to notice the robust power delivery on this card, as it's a beautiful thing to see on a card built for overclocking. I really wish I had a water block for this card, so I could really stick the voltage to it. Now that we got the card back together, let's take a look at overclocking. Now since this is an older EVGA card, it's usually recommended to use an older version of EVGA's precision tool when overclocking. But I quickly figured out that I could do everything I needed to with the current version of MSI Afterburner, along with EVGA's EV-Tune tool. Now this card has a base clock of 855 MHz and a shader clock of 1710 with a memory clock of 2004. Now some of the 3GB Classified models have slightly higher memory clocks, but unfortunately this one does not. I can't adjust the core voltage with Afterburner regardless of what setting is used, so this is where the EV-Tune tool comes into play. You first need to make sure the card has the overclock BIOS set, and then fire up EV-Tune and adjust the NVVDD slider. Now I tested a number of voltages, but I ended up settling on 1.3 volts. Now at this voltage I was able to achieve 1 GHz on the core and 2 GHz on the shader clock. Unfortunately, the memory in this card is just not very good. I was able to crank it up 100 MHz beyond stock, but anything above that would crash. I could have upped the memory voltage on these Hynix modules, but I decided just to leave it be. Unfortunately, with this much voltage, I had to peg the fan at 100%, and at this speed, it's just really loud. A couple of you were interested, so I've included a screenshot of GPU-Z and showing the ASIC quality of the chip as well. Also, here's a quick look at our test system that I used for all of our benchmark runs. It's now time to test performance in 10 modern games. The first game up is Rainbow Six Siege, and at 1080p with the medium preset, the stock clock Classy produced 50 frames per second. Now, after dialing in our overclock, performance increased 14% to 57. Now, you can see VRAM usage stayed below 2 GB during the built-in benchmark and during our gameplay capture. Now, frame times remain consistent and exceptional during our entire capture. I also wanted to note the green line on the graph represents the stock run, and the magenta line represents the overclock. Let's jump over to a newer title, Destiny 2. Now we tested at 1080p using the medium preset, and at stock clocks we averaged 56 frames per second. Overclock, the number grew 12% to 63. Now this game played extremely well, but we did run into a couple frame time issues at stock clock speeds. Now this was tested many times and was repeatable every time. As soon as we overclocked the card, these issues all disappeared. Fortnite is the next game up, and man do I suck at it. And at 1080p using the high preset with medium shadows, we averaged 77 frames per second. Now once overclocked, that number rose 15% to 89. Now that's some great performance scaling right there. Now VRAM usage hovered in the 2.2 range much of the capture. Frame time consistency wasn't that great at stock, but it definitely improved once overclocked. Now on to Shadow of War. And using the medium preset at 1080p, we averaged 43 frames per second. Now after applying the overclock, we saw a 14% gain to 49. Now VRAM usage hovered in the 2.4 to 2.5 range much of the time. And frame times looked pretty good during the capture, though Fraps doesn't work properly in this game, so unfortunately not able to show you the frame time data. The 2016 version of Doom is up, and I'll be quite honest, performance here quite surprised me. And we tested at 1080p using the high preset with SMAA, and at stock we averaged 49 frames per second. Overclocked, the number rose 14% to 56. Now VRAM usage hovered in the 2.6 GB range, and frame times were extremely tight. Now keep in mind, since Fermi GPUs do not support Vulkan, this was all OpenGL. Now I've tested many Fermi cards in this game, and they don't even come close to this card's performance. I truly believe the high core count, high clocks, and extra VRAM really helped this card soar. Now on to the oldest game in our test suite, GTA 5. This game is still very popular, and that's why I always try to include it in my tests. Now Fermi GPUs are known to rip through this game, so this card is certainly no exception. Now using all very high settings and FXAA at 1080p, we averaged 61 frames per second, and after dialing in the overclock, we saw that number jump up 13% to 69. Now VRAM usage looked good, only sitting in the 2.5 GB range much of the time. Frame times also looked great, but we did experience some slight micro stutter, but the millisecond spread is so low, it can't be seen with your console eyes. PUBG has taken a bit of a backseat to Fortnite lately, but it's still a very popular fugly game. Now I chose 1080p using the medium preset, and we averaged 48 frames per second. Now while it doesn't seem that impressive for a Fermi-based card, it really is. Having 3 GB of VRAM in this game really helped out, as I did see usage up to 2.7 GB. Now stutter was present, but it's pretty much a staple in this game when using older GPUs. For Honor is up next, and here we ramped up the settings to the high preset and tested at 1080p. Now, stock we averaged 51 frames per second, overclocked that number rose 13% to 58. Now VRAM usage stayed below 2 GB, and frame times were extremely tight with no inconsistencies seen. Now this is a really impressive result for this old beast. Far Cry 5 is the second to last game we tested, and we chose the normal preset at 1080p, but we only mustered 31 frames per second. Overclock, we did see it rise 16% to 36, so it's nearly perfect overclock scaling in this title. Frame times were really tight, but this game was really too much for this card. The Classy did have some VRAM to spare, but not enough grunt or driver optimizations to really make it shine. And I saved the best for last, kind of. I say that because Fermi GPUs have limited DirectX 12 support, so why not try a DX12 only game? Now, Gears of War 4 was tested at 1080p using the media preset, and we did average 54 frames per second. Overclock, we saw that number rise 14% to 62. Now, frame times exhibited a lot of microstutter at the beginning using the stock clocks, but it all disappeared when the card was overclocked. I did test this multiple times, and it remained the same through all my results. Regardless, it's still really amazing to see this type of performance in a newer game with this Fermi powerhouse. Well, that wraps up our game testing, so let's jump into some synthetics. Now, first up, we have Unigen Superposition. Using the 1080p medium setting, stock we scored 3948. After overclocking, that number jumped up to 4538, and that's nearly a 15% increase in performance, which is great scaling. Now let's move on to an older Unigen benchmark, Unigen Valley. And here we chose the Extreme HD preset and got a score of 1501. Overclocked, the number rose 12% to 1692. That's a pretty good result in my opinion. And the last synthetic test we have today is 3D Mark Firestrike Standard. Now the stock Classy obtained a GPU score of 5199. After overclocking, it rose to 5964, which is pretty good. For those of you with a 750 Ti, maybe a GTX 760 or a 960 or a comparable AMD card, please feel free to post your results for any of these synthetics down in the comments section. I'd like to see some for comparison's sake. Let's wrap up our testing with power consumption numbers. Now, I measured stock and overclock power consumption on two separate systems. I first used my 2600K overclock testbed, and then I used my 5820K overclock testbed. Now looking at the bottom, you can see the 2600K system pulled 339 watts from the wall. The 5820K system pulled 424. Now after we applied our 1.3 volts, the 2600K system pulled 476 watts at the wall, and the 5820K pulled 567. Now that's quite the difference, as the 5820K system is a bit piggish. Now these numbers are all measured at the wall with the watt meter, and keep in mind if the 580 was water cooled, power consumption would definitely drop a little bit. That wraps up our testing for the GTX 580 classified 3GB. Now I pretty much answered a lot of the questions I presented at the beginning of the video, except for the main one. Is Fermi dead? Well, if you consider the fact that NVIDIA ceased driver support in March of this year, the answer to them would be yes. But it's not likely that drivers did anything to increase gaming performance. Probably just some bug fixes and patches here and there. I believe the real Fermi killer is a lack of VRAM. As you can see, without driver optimizations, the 3GB GTX 580 is still very capable at playing modern games at 1080p with medium settings. I mean, it's no HD 7970, but it still holds its own today in the games that I've tested. While I don't own the 1.5GB version, I can't imagine it would keep pace with this card in this test suite. So keep in mind, in a lot of these games I still had VRAM left in the table, so we could always increase the texture detail as well. And while performance numbers and everything looks great, there is an Achilles heel for the king of Fermis, and that is Ubisoft games. I tested only Far Cry 5 in my test suite, but I also fired up Assassin's Creed Origins and Ghost Recon Wildlands, and they both ran like absolute dog crap. On top of the artifacts and glitches that we experienced in both games, performance was in the 20 FPS range on low settings at 1080p in both. So if Ubisoft games were the only consideration, then Fermi is riding shotgun to its own funeral. Alright people, well that wraps up my look at the EVGA GTX 580 classified in 2018. If you enjoyed content like this, then please consider subscribing to my channel and hit that notification bell to get updated as well. Also, if you'd like to help support my work on this channel, then please consider using my Amazon and Humble Bundle affiliate links found in the video's description. And as always, thanks for taking the time to watch the video.